You care where you sit?
I have no desire. Yeah, we want to.
Tonight, my name is Katya Wald. I'm the executive director at the MIT Enterprise Forum in Cambridge. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm really particularly excited about this one because I think this is a very timely topic. Just to go over tonight's agenda, we are panel discussions from 6 to 7:15, and then we will just head right back there for some networking from 7:15 to 8. So please feel free to stick around. How many people have been to our events before? Wow, good. So a lot of you haven't. So I'm just going to do a quick overview about who we are and what we do. We are a 40-year-old organization, so we have been around. We're sort of the granddaddy of the entrepreneurship organizations. We primarily focus on identifying technologies that matter. That's programs that engage all the stakeholders of the innovation ecosystem as part of our efforts to support technology entrepreneurs. Our board chair always says it best. He says we help entrepreneurs choose markets. So these types of things are what we do for them. We also have a series of events that focus on very practical content for entrepreneurs, trying to help them tackle real-world challenges. So we really believe that our greatest impact is in accelerating the success of early-stage companies, as early as concept and pre-seed, but very prior to significant institutional funding. To that end, we have a bunch of upcoming programs, including a class that we call Start Smart for entrepreneurs, which really goes through the nuts and bolts of starting your company. It begins on February 25th, and we run that for 8 classes. We have a program coming up on energy storage and new business models fueling rapid growth. We are doing an IP consideration for protecting your company's innovation on March 6th. We have a mentor program. We run 2 cohorts a year, and so we have an open application for both entrepreneurs and mentors that is open from March 1st to March 31st. We have our big Connected Things IoT conference on March 25th. And then we'll actually be back here at Nutter on April 10th for an event called Breaking the Ice with Angels. I do want to thank all of our sponsors who support us over the years. That includes Witham, Caldwell IP, Chen PR, Hamilton Brooks Smith Reynolds, Insight Data Science, who is a special sponsor for tonight, Morris Barnes Brown and Pendleton, Nutter, our host tonight. Thank you very much for letting us use your beautiful space, and Wolf Greenfield. I'm really excited to hear the panelists. Just would love to invite April Minsky up here from Insight Data Science to introduce Insight and the rest of the speakers.
Hi everyone, I'm April from Insight Data Science. We're super excited to be hosting this event tonight with the MIT Enterprise Forum. Insight Data Science is a 7-week training to help folks transition out of academia into the industry for careers in data. So we help awesome, smart people get jobs, and we partner with teams to help hire awesome, great people. And so data ethics comes up a lot in the work that we do. We've built up a community of alumni in Boston and great hiring teams in Boston, and so we really like to do events like this to bring that community together. So I will hand it off to Karen.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Karen Howe. I'm a reporter at MIT Technology Review, and I cover artificial intelligence, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all so much for coming, and also to the people on the live stream. So today, data ethics is such an expansive topic, so I wanted to first frame the discussion by saying that we are going to focus on a very small slice, and that is data collection and data privacy, because I think that is one of the most pertinent discussions happening right now in the tech industry. Our discussion is going to be broken up into 3 parts. So first, we're going to talk about what does it even mean to practice data ethics. That's such a nebulous term. Second, what kinds of systems can we build at an organizational level and at a government level to facilitate the practice of data ethics? And then hopefully by part 3, we will have some key takeaways and action items for each of you to bring into your day-to-day lives either as a consumer or as someone who runs an organization or a project. And so before I introduce the panelists, or let the panelists introduce themselves, I wanted to start with an activity. So if everyone can please stand, and for people on the live stream, please think about this too. So for each of, I'm going to say a series of statements, and for each of these statements, I want you to stay standing if you think it is unethical, and sit yourself down if you think it is ethical. Number 1, a healthcare provider collects your data and uses it to provide you better services. Stay standing if you think it's unethical. Sit down if you think it's ethical.
Can you repeat it?
A healthcare provider collects your data and uses it to provide you better services.
Do we know about it? Yeah.
That's it. That's all the information you get.
Wow.
Interesting. Okay. A private company collects your data and uses it to provide you better services.
What kind of company?
Okay.
We're supposed to stand back up.
Oh yeah. Please stand back up if you think that's unethical. But stay seated if you think that's ethical.
Do you want to estimate the percentage for the live stream people? The ballpark. Is this fun to watch?
Okay, so for the live stream, we had maybe like 5 people for the first standing, and now we have about like 3 times the amount. So that's interesting. Healthcare provider to private company. Okay, private company collects your data to provide you better services, but also sells it to advertisers for profit. Stand up if you think that's unethical. Okay, wow, that was like, wow, okay. Is there peer pressure happening? Maybe people are like standing as they see. So I think like 80% of the people are standing right now. Private company collects your data to provide you better services and also sells your data to insurance companies who use it to set your premium. Stand up if you think that. The remaining people that are seated. Okay, a healthcare provider collects your data to provide you better services and sells it to insurance companies to set your premium. Did anyone switch?
With or without consent?
With consent.
With consent.
With consent.
Okay.
Interesting. Can I give it to you to explain why you switched?
Yeah. My name is Sarah. I think that if the consumer is informed about what data, if they can consent or not consent to their data being given, and they're not like strong-armed into consenting, but it's actually truly consent, then I don't have a problem with it. If I allow my data to be used in that way, then to me that's ethical because I've said, yeah, I consent to my data being used in that way.
Having heard her explanation, would anyone like to switch their stance? Yeah, whichever.
Oh.
Oh, interesting. Well done. Okay. Last one. A healthcare provider collects your data to create life-saving drugs and also sells it to insurance companies to set your premium.
And this is still with consent.
With consent.
Consent and understanding are not the same thing.
Would you like to talk more?
You're assuming that the consent form is comprehensible, which it will not be.
Would you like the microphone? Yes, consent can be implicit, it can be explicit, and it is not the same as understanding what the company is going to do with that data.
When it's going to be deleted, if it's going to be deleted, you can delete it. Great, thank you. Okay, you can all sit down. So I hope that got you thinking about some of the questions that we will be talking about tonight. And with that, I would like to introduce the panelists. So if each of you could give a 1-minute elevator pitch about what you work on and who you are.
That was a fantastic exercise, Karen. I'm going to steal that for later on. Hi, my name is Irene. I am a PhD student at MIT in computer science, focusing on machine learning for healthcare, specifically on the fairness of these algorithms. So what kind of disparate impact are they causing, and how do we audit and or fix that potentially through data, which is causing some problems and might also fix some problems as well. In my free time, we talk a lot about AI ethics at MIT, and Leilani, who's in the audience, and Harini and I have started the MIT AI Ethics Club, which has had an overwhelming enthusiasm from the student population. So I'm very excited to discuss a little bit more about how data ethics ties into AI ethics, and also what that implications might be for some of the other panelists.
Thank you. My name is John Locknane. I'm a partner here at Nutter in the business group. I think we actually have some future lawyers in the group here, based upon the introductory exercises. I'm at least convinced that lawyers are not going to go out of style after listening to the introductory exercise. My background includes work at the intersection of law, finance, and technology. I previously in my career served as a law clerk for a federal judge. I also was in-house at PTC, which used to be out in Needham, but is now 2 buildings down the street here. I have a particular interest in privacy and security. I'm a member of IntraGuard, which is the private alliance between government and private industry around security issues. I hold a CIPP US designation for the International Association of Privacy Professionals, along with my colleague Pat Concannon, who's in the audience as well. And I've got an article coming out in an ABA book, American Bar Association book, on privacy and security geared towards in-house counsel.
Hi, I'm Claire Bernard, and I work as the Director of Product in the Data Sciences platform at the Broad Institute. You can think of us like a kind of 200-person tech company within the Broad Institute. And my team in particular processes, stores, and manages access to a lot of the data that's produced at the Broad. So all of the data that comes from the Broad Sequencing Center, as well as some of the other programs in the Broad that generate data. So all of the data that we manage is data from human subjects research. So a lot of the issues around regulations for that, privacy, ethics, come up frequently in our work.
Good evening. My name is Greg Wolf. I'm founder and CEO of Coalesce.ai. And at Coalesce, we are involved with surveillance and monitoring, using AI to improve surveillance and monitoring, specifically in financial services. So that's our space. And obviously, the world of financial services around privacy that's a big topic. Well, we also run a think tank here in Boston with about senior executive representatives from 10 of the most prominent financial services firms here in Boston, Fidelity, State Street, Ameriprise, Manulife, etc., as well as a number of former regulators, folks from the OCC, former director of the SEC, and actually one of our think tank members over here, Tim Duncan, who's was involved with the initiation of the CFPB, so I'm sure Tim's got some thoughts on this as well. And in our think tank, we're exploring the boundaries around data analytics and AI and risk management around this new type of technology. So thanks for having me here tonight.
Hey, good evening. I'm Dan Stoll. I'm head of engineering at Canopy. We're a privacy startup. We're building an app that every morning gives you 5 delightful article and podcast recommendations and privately learns what you like to read and listen to. We're building this to show people that to get personalization on the web, you don't have to give away all of your data. In fact, you have to give away very, very little that we can't tie to you.
Great, thank you. So for part 1, what does it mean to practice data ethics? I wanted to start by asking the panelists, this is your version of the audience exercise. How many of you read the New York Times story about apps that track your location data? So for those of you who might not, I'm just going to read the main passage that describes what happened. At least 75 companies receive anonymous precise location data from apps whose users enable location services to get local news and weather or other information. Several of those businesses claim to track up to 200 million mobile devices in the US, about half those in use last year. The companies sell, use, or analyze the data to cater to advertisers, retail outlets, and even hedge funds seeking insights into customer behavior. It's a hot market with sales of location-targeted advertising reaching an estimated $21 billion this year. So I wanted to ask each of you, at which point in this article did you actually start feeling things were unethical? Because from the activity in the beginning, it seems like most people are comfortable with data collection being used for services, and the line is crossed when there's suddenly profit involved. But I'm sure each panelist might weigh in about where you draw that line.
I can start. So I'm going to invoke a couple principles from human subjects research. I think one of them, and this came up in the exercise, starting off with, is voluntary informed consent is really, really important. When you read that article, it's very clear that a lot of the people who were giving away their data didn't realize what it was being used for. And they knew that someone was keeping their data, but they didn't know that they were selling it. They didn't know that it could be used in aggregate. They didn't understand the extent to which it was going to be used. And I think that's a really important part of informed consent. Informed consent should include how that data is going to be used downstream as much as possible. Another principle that we use for human subjects research is that the benefits should outweigh the risks. And I think that's also important to consider, or applies to some of these situations as well. If it's an app that is providing the user very minimal benefit, but then it's storing tons of information about that user that's actually exposing them to a lot of risk, that's a problem.
Yes, I would say you cross the line when the value exchange is not clear. Am I giving you data so you can tell me what the weather is going to be in an hour? Great. Or am I giving you data and then it's going to people that I don't even know exist? That's over the line. And as far as where you drew that line in terms of, is data collection the problem? At Canopy, we think, yes, we want to build a system that can't be used against people. You don't have to trust even us, even the company offering the service.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian view tonight to keep things interesting, and look at it from a slightly different angle. So in financial services, as I think in most things, there's always a trade-off between privacy and security, right? You walk into a building, they ask you for your ID, it's an inconvenience, but you feel more secure because they have processes and procedures in place when you enter the building tonight. So I think where that line is for our clients, and as a result regulators, is where when you start doing harm to people as a result of lack of privacy, losing their privacy, specifically things around fraud and identity theft, which can have a devastating financial impact on somebody's life. So I think in areas like healthcare and financial wellness and financial well-being of people, that's a particularly risky area, and it's a very thorny area in terms of where is that line, where do we feel comfortable. So for instance, we have, I know Karen, you like examples, right? So we're working on a project with 3 banks in collaboration, using data analytics and AI technology for them to share information around loan applicants who are essentially fraudsters, right, scammers. And one of the ways that they're being able to determine whether somebody's a scammer or whether they're not when they apply for loans, and the fraud that the banks are subject to is millions of dollars, is tracking IP addresses and validating whether it's really you when you say, I'm applying for this credit card. So on the one hand, gee, I don't want the bank tracking where I'm applying from. On the other hand, it's like, well, I want them to do that to everybody else, so they're going to stop them from applying for a credit card in my name. So that's where I feel like there's the slippery slope. And there's areas where you're adding privacy, using the private information to protect people from financial, possibly healthcare, could work to our advantage.
But who watches the watchers?
Well, that's a good question. I think we have a follow-up section here on regulation, right? I don't know. We could spend the whole evening having this conversation, but I'm glad I introduced some conflict here.
So if I could just add to that, I think your question talked about data ethics, but perhaps just because I'm the lawyer on the panel, I should note that there's clearly a distinction between what's legal and what's ethical. And I would say that the law is a moral minimum, right? You can't be operating in an ethical way if you're violating the law. I think you could be potentially operating in an ethically improper way, even though you're not violating the law. So my view is the law is a moral minimum. You have to at least be sure that you're following all applicable privacy and security standards. I think part of the issue with the hypos is that in the New York Times article is that there's business practices that were outlined that potentially are unfair and deceptive to the consumer. And the FTC says that businesses that operate in an unfair and deceptive way, that's improper. So as a company that's collecting data, you have to at least make sure you're complying with what the law is. And it's not easy to comply with the law on privacy and security. It's very patchwork by nature here in the United States. And you have to consider international issues as well. But you at least need to do that, privacy and security law compliance. Then you have to think beyond that. What am I doing that's potentially going to be objectionable to consumers, even if it's legally acceptable? And I think some of the concern that we saw in the room is that it's possible to really operate in an offensive way, even though you're operating legally.
I'll just chime in with a slightly different dimension than some of the excellent points that have been raised, which is that technology innovates incredibly quickly. A lot of the laws that have been written, a lot of the ethical debates that we've had did not anticipate a time where we could aggregate millions of IP addresses in a split second. And I'm sure 10 years from now, technology will evolve that we will have very furious debates about that now we wouldn't even be able to conceive of. At MIT, we have an email list that the computer science department frequently discusses, and often there will be research from one MIT professor that will go out, and other people on the email list will say, whoa, I didn't realize we could do that. That seems interesting. Should we be doing that? What's going on? And here we have live conversations about what is okay and not okay. That's evolving right there. So your question originally, Karen, was referring to what are the data ethics of this particular situation, but I would wonder what are the moral principles to guide further innovation and further thoughts, especially as informed consent might be different, considering who is understanding what could happen later versus what is feasible in this moment.
Yeah, I want to return to an idea that each of you sort of touched on, which is who are the decision makers? Because each of you had comments saying, oh, well, it's if you do a cost-benefit analysis and the costs outweigh the benefits, then it is not ethical, or if the benefits outweigh the cost, then it is ethical. But who are the people that are making those decisions, and who are the people that are creating these moral guidelines for future innovation?
It's a great question because I'm actually not sure who gets to decide at this point. The legislation is very lacking, and at this point, in my experience, a lot of the times it's the engineer or the researcher who says, oh, I don't think we should be working on this. And other than that, it's an open field. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts.
We've done a lot of user research over the past year, and people feel like they've lost control of their data, and there's nothing they can do about it. So they don't feel like that they have a say, and we've got to give them a say.
So I have a bit of a different answer here, coming from an industry that is very regulated. So for us, there's actually groups of people who are put together in. So on the when we do direct participant studies where we'll look for people who have a certain type of cancer and reach out to them directly so that they can consent to have their samples used and they can participate in the research. And for any project like that, there's an institutional review board. So this is a group of people that approves everything we do. Everything as small as, if we change, so we ask them survey questions to answer questions about themselves and about their disease. And if we change the picture on the back of the website, that's something that we have to run by the institutional review board. And if we change the order of the survey questions, that's something we have to run by the institutional review board. And then on the other side, when we're giving people access to data, there's again a group of people that has to review when you have a set of data that is that has been consented to use on a particular type of research. And then a researcher applies to access that data. that application has to go through, again, a group of people who match up whether that research purpose aligns with the consent that was originally given for that data. And in both cases, like, these are regulations that definitely need to be there. We absolutely believe in having these regulations in place. There's lots of cases before we had this where many very unethical things happened. But the process is also really manual. Like, that process of getting the picture confirmed can sometimes take 6 months. Getting access to data through a data access committee can take a really, really long time. In fact, so long that sometimes researchers will just give up on getting access to a certain data set and say, okay, I'll do my research on something that I can get access to easier. So this is something, some of the tools that we build, everything that we build in our group is open source and kind of for the world. And a lot of the tools that we build are built specifically to enforce these regulations, abide by the regulations, but also try to speed them up so that a researcher can get access to the data that they are allowed access to.
So to follow up on your point, would you say that this is a model that should be considered for people that are not within the healthcare medical data realm?
I wouldn't say that it necessarily needs to be a group of people in the same way, but I think that a lot of the principles apply. So for example, in the case of the Data Access Committee, this is something that we've done a lot of work on, kind of data use ontologies and algorithms that can match up a research purpose with a type of consent so that you can automate some of that process, and that's something that we're trying to do. But absolutely, a lot of the principles should be applied elsewhere, I think.
Would anyone like to respond to that idea?
How long does it take to get access?
Well, so that's what we're working on. Right? these regulations, obviously, like 6 months to change a picture. It's really, really hard. I have another colleague who was actually collecting consent from people in rural Haiti. And it had to be physical signatures on a form. And so he was like driving around Haiti on a moped and actually like talking people through these forms, making sure they were, that informed consent, everything was proper. Like, took a really, really long time. And then he was in a rainstorm and on his moped, and so the consent forms just got completely wiped out. And so those samples couldn't be used. The IRB said, no, absolutely not. So I'm not saying that these regulations aren't challenging. They're definitely challenging, and we need to work to speed them up. But the principles, I think, need to be in place.
Who gets to create these principles? Is it the research community? Is there a sort of an FDA type body where you can submit something and they approve it or deprove it or require you to do a recall? For many data ethics issues, I often wonder, can we trust people to police themselves? Can we trust people to be part of the team that's policing themselves? And how should that work?
Well, go.
Okay. All right, so I got something to add to this topic, regulations. Karen gave me some homework. She said, go talk about regulations, right? The history of regulations. So at the risk of boring you, can I just walk you through? And I'm not the lawyer, so John can help out on this one.
Small font.
Would you be interested for me to walk you through the regulations of data privacy in the last few years? Okay. All right, so 1974 Privacy Act, right? That's the foundation. And I'm specifically talking from the context of financial services, obviously, but this applies across the board. So the Privacy Act defines personally identifiable information, PII. And I'm sure anybody heard of PII? Yeah? Anybody had problems with PII? All right, this is a very hot topic. And what that means is protected information, sensitive personal information, SPI is another version of that, allows you to trace an individual's identity, so some information that allows you to identify, oh, this was Greg, or it's linkable to an individual's record, medical, education, financial, and employment, so those sensitive things that we care about, right? And this requires the written consent of the individual, back to Sarah's comments earlier. So 74, and that's changed over the years and evolved as technologies evolved, right? So then 96 is the HIPAA Act, which obviously Claire knows a lot more about being in the healthcare space. And the goal of the HIPAA Act was to healthcare and insurance PII protected from fraud and theft. So note this consistent theme of fraud and theft, where people really get hurt by lack of privacy, okay? Then 2004, California Online Privacy Protection Act, where basically that was where they mandated, 2004, early days in the internet, where they mandated, click here to consent that your information is being captured by the website, right? So kind of just some really basic information, protection in terms of having the consumer opt into whether they're being contacted physically or online, right? All right, then the real stuff starts to happen, and there's actually a good punchline at the end of this, so I think you're happy about this. So 99, the Data Protection Act, which came in under the Glam-Leach-Bliley Financial Services protecting the confidentiality and integrity of NPI. So this is when the government starts to really say, okay, you've really got to control how this information is being shared. But then balancing that in 2001, the USA Patriot Act, which says, well, wait a minute, we're protecting some of the bad guys here too, so we're going to allow financial institutions to share information, especially around money laundering and fraud and all the bad stuff, to protect the good people, okay? Still evolving. Our home state, 2010, Massachusetts General Law, CMR 17.00, got that right? That was actually one of the first, we were one of the first states to really target protecting non-public information, fraud, identity theft, etc. But the big one, of course, is 2016. And anybody know what happened in 2016? GDPR, exactly. So General Data Protection Regulation. This is after all the identity thefts and I think before Equifax, but after TJ Maxx, you know, the big credit card hacks where the European government said, wait a minute, stop. This is ridiculous. Okay, people are losing their livelihoods. They're getting scammed. They're losing their identities. This is crazy. Stop. We're going to put in some very draconian regulations on financial services firms to prevent them from letting this information get out inadvertently, right? And protecting them. So the types, so protects personal data by processors for EU members, even if they're outside the EU. So anybody who deals in banking and financial services, you have one customer who's European and you've got to maintain this high bar. So the regulation is good. We're a little lax in the US, but Europe is pretty serious about this. So penalties are $20 million or 4% of annual revenue for disclosing without consent, right? So think of a big bank like a JP Morgan, 4% of their annual revenue in penalties for a data breach, right? This is pretty serious stuff. 2% for not maintaining good record keeping. And here's the things that GDPR covers, right? Somebody, I think, over there said, you know, what are the elements? What should be covered, right? Mandatory breach notification. So the bank has to tell the government there was a breach. Usage transparency. Frankly, I'm not quite sure what that means anymore. Right to be forgotten. So somebody said over there, what about deleting my records? Okay. And data portability. The ability for me to say, I'm moving from bank A to bank B, take all my information and move it across. And this culminates with, in November 18, right, so a few months ago, the European Consumer Protection Bureau 7 countries are filing complaints against Google for their location tracking app because they're maintaining that is a breach of GDPR. Okay, I said my piece.
Thank you.
If I knew that I could have given statutory sites and I would have come much more prepared. So,
rock star.
So John, what I wanted to ask you from a lawyer's perspective, I mean, GDPR is a really interesting topic because not everyone agrees that it was a win in terms of regulating data privacy. So from a legal perspective, what were the trade-offs that were made when that regulation was put in place?
well, a couple of takeaways if I can, and I'll wrap that
Sure.
in. I think that's really interesting to hear the sort of litany of the laws. A few things to know about that. In the race between finance, technology, and law, who's coming in third place? Law. And it's not even close, right? Finance and technology are moving at the speed of light, right? Really, really quick. The law is always catching up. It's always behind. And that's the case. There's certain segments of industry information, credit, financial, education, healthcare, very sensitive areas. The law is always trying to react appropriately in those areas. But there's other areas, location services, that really the law hadn't really thought about before and dealt with. And after the GDPR, the most recent legislative activity actually took place in the United States. Folks familiar with it? California, right? So California, starting January 1, 2020, will now have a new privacy law modeled after some of the concepts in the GDPR. My understanding is that when people talk about GDPR, they talk about it as people in Europe have a different concept of privacy than people in the United States typically historically have had. And their approach to it is that privacy is a fundamental human entitlement. And that law reflects that reality. The United States has been more of, hey, it's for sale, right? Fend for yourself. It's not working too well. There is probably a trend towards a national privacy law in the United States, but who do we need to cooperate to get that done? The United States Senate. Congress, yes, Senate, House of Representatives. That can't be an easy thing to do, given all the other issues that exist down in DC at the moment. However, I do think that over time, it's likely that GDPR-type protections, as also reflected in the California law, will take some sort of national, it has to. Otherwise, we're going to have 50 different laws in this country, which will just make it administratively impossible for a company to really apply in good faith. Did I answer your question?
I don't know, did you?
I'm going to say I did.
Can I add something there? I don't mean to monopolize here, but I can't believe that as the technologist, I'm the one who's speaking on behalf of the regulators here. But we're actually working with the government, folks in Congress, specifically Senate Banking Committee and House Financial Services Committee, because they are, and this is a result of the think tank that we got some prominence and they were interested in some of the work that we're doing. Because they're as concerned about this stuff as we are. And to your point, government and legal infrastructure, lags behind industry because we're out there innovating. So we actually have a number of initiatives specifically around money laundering and sharing information and using more advanced data in the world of artificial intelligence algorithms around protecting people from fraud and terrorism and human trafficking, arms dealing, drug, really bad stuff. So the government is actually really interested in moving steps forward, but they're looking for a path.
Yeah, and I think if a company or an industry wants to avoid bad regulation, they should get out in front of it and try to develop industry standards that set the bar at an acceptable level and try to have regulation that sort of coalesces around what those standards are.
That is a very good segue into Canopy and the work that you're doing, because Dan, I think you represent sort of the extreme side of the tech industry in which you are taking a very, very data privacy-centric stance without any regulation in place in the US to force you in that direction.
Yeah, we want to build a system that can't be used against people. So you shouldn't have to trust us. And it's been really hard. We are upending the engineering that's gone into every tech giant that's trying to target you with ads. And we're moving a lot of the processing that's happened on big company servers onto the phone. And so a lot of things that are straightforward and you can take for granted when you're allowed to pull all the user data into a giant database with everything you know about somebody on a single row. It's really hard. Even something so simple as making sure that somebody doesn't get a duplicate recommendation on their phone is really hard when you can't just keep a big list somewhere. It's possible though. And we're starting with that premise, and we've drawn this line in the sand of your data stays with you, and it is possible. I want us to succeed. I want us to be a great company. I also want to nudge the universe away from gathering data needlessly, because we don't. Other companies can do this. It is possible.
Can you explain how you're currently approaching that?
Yeah. So on your phone, we build up a noisy representation of your taste. We say, okay, this is what you like to read and listen to. and then we add noise to that, and then we use that representation of you to make recommendations. That representation of you is not stored to an IP address. It's not stored to email. You don't log in. We don't know who you are. We just give you delightful recommendations. And we're coming out of Spotify, Instagram, the New York Times, Twitter. We know how to build these systems and just how little data you need to know about somebody in order to make delightful recommendations. So that's what we're building.
So what are some of the trade-offs that you've had to make in preserving people's privacy along the way? Like, are your recommendations not as good? What are the things that you've had to sacrifice?
The recommendations are great.
Nice job.
To be honest, the hard thing is, I'm sure anyone in software will recognize this system is incredibly hard to debug. You don't know anything about, you know very little about anyone who's using it. In particular, you don't know what recommendations they are actually seeing on their phone. So if they're unhappy with you, it's really hard to tell why. That's been a huge challenge, which we're taking a multifaceted approach to. We've hired a director of editorial who's making sure we're only recommending the best stuff on the internet to minimize the impact of mistakes. We've built a way to privately gather metrics using differential privacy, which is also going to be in the 2020 census, by the way. So yeah, we haven't had to sacrifice on recommendation quality, but we've had to sacrifice in being able to snoop on people.
Sorry to keep putting heat on you, but
I'm still here.
One thing that we talked about before the panel is the other thing that you've sort of sacrificed along the way is you do not yet know how you're going to monetize and scale a business plan.
Yeah, that's because we've got several choices. We could, so we're building this recommendation app right now. We would love to be able to serve private, ethical ads within this app. We would love to partner with other startups who care about privacy. We'd love to work with the DuckDuckGo folks. They love us. We would also love to work with existing companies who want to comply with GDPR, but don't want to spend the lawyer fees and engineering time it takes to protect personally identifiable data. That last one's very interesting because if we work with somebody and they're using us for private personalization over here, and over here, everywhere else they're sucking up data and selling it to data brokers, well then we've lost all credibility and we'll have to close up.
Irene, I want to toss it to you.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the different approaches for data privacy, regulatory approaches, a company doing that. I feel like you would have a perspective on how organizations who don't necessarily have that DNA within their company yet, how they can start creating organizational level systems to practice data ethics.
Definitely. So as some background that I didn't mention, before my PhD, I worked at Dropbox for 2 years. And that was a time when Dropbox was a lot smaller than it is now and was actually starting to develop its analytics framework. So before I joined, we didn't really have a good sense of who was doing what on Dropbox because we didn't log it very well and we didn't analyze it at all. And the hope was that by analyzing it, by bending the privacy and sort of taking a peek into what was going on within the company walls, we would get a sense of what was going on with each user and perhaps build a better service. And comparing that then with my experiences now with building healthcare algorithms. So here we go into a hospital, we use the data, I am a unpaid researcher with Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and I have to have 10 vaccines just to be able to SSH into the data server. But now I have the access to be able to see the data, to see the patient data and run my algorithms on it, and one day deploy it on Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in order to improve patient care. So when I think about both of these experiences, one of the things that pops into mind is that most people are very benevolent. Most people want to be able to do the good thing, and they certainly don't want their company or their hospital or any kind of lab group name splashed over the New York Times as inappropriately leaking data, using it for malevolence, et cetera. And certainly every PhD student I've talked to doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history either. But I think something that is missing a lot of the times is this nuanced discussion then of, well, where is that line? Even in this room of a self-identified audience of people who are here at a data ethics panel, there was a little bit of variance in who thought different steps were ethical. In my experience at MIT, it is unfortunately not something that we think about as very much. And through starting this AI ethics reading group, we've started to discuss it a little bit more, but it is not a class yet. It is not something that we all have to take required, curriculum. And so when I was at Dropbox, we kind of made it up as we go. We have procedures in place now. We do analytics on people. We do use that to improve their product experience. But that was very much as we went, the people who were on that team kind of searched inside themselves and made a decision. Now, as I work on healthcare algorithms, there's a little bit more in place. There's human subjects regulations. There's a lot of parallels to the FDA that we have to now obey. There is peer review as we submit our conference papers out. But there's still some gray areas. And I think one of the things I'm looking forward to in the next 10 years or so is the generation of researchers, the generation of engineers or people who even touch the data, lawyers, having to take a stand and say, this is where I sit down, this is where I'm not okay, this is where I would like to lodge a complaint, and then hopefully someone will build an avenue where I can lodge my complaint and have that be recorded.
So from those two different perspectives, you're saying that in one experience, it was sort of a free-for-all, and you had to search within yourself to figure out where the guidelines are, and in the other space, there are very, very clear guidelines. What were the things that you were able to achieve in the Dropbox scenario that you can no longer achieve now, and vice versa?
Oh, interesting. So I should be clear that at Dropbox we did have some regulations. For the live stream people, don't email the CEO and let him know. So we could not see people's files, for example. Like that was just two people in the entire company could do that, and they were probably lawyers, and that was a whole other thing. But we could see people's activity. We could see their IP addresses. We could see a lot of things. And none of this is illegal. These are all data points that I was able to say, oh, let's build a model of if this person will go from free paying Dropbox to monthly paying Dropbox if they are from Alaska and they're a student and they wake up at 7 a.m. and they do these things, we're probably going to get them. We should send them targeted emails now. And that was something that we continue to do. I'm not there anymore, but I'm hoping we continue to do that because I built some of that framework. But that's something that we are able to do. And that is something that we, to be honest, probably didn't discuss as much about safety or whether or not we should, or weighing the costs and benefits or informed consent. A lot of the things that are being raised here. When I joined Dropbox, it was 600 people. I was the only data scientist for a long time, and that was something that I talked to product managers about, and we built it. Now that we're on the machine learning for healthcare side, there are a lot more people involved, and everything I do has to be checked. And as a result, we don't do things like, oh, if you come into the hospital and your IP address says this, and then you do this, and then you take. And as a result, our data is limited to what is in the electronic health record. Our data is limited to what has been approved by HIPAA, that a team of lawyers at the hospital and then another team of lawyers at MIT have all agreed upon is data that I can now access for my research. So to answer your actual question, Karen, the data that I have access to is much smaller, and as a result, the research I can do is theoretically much more limited.
Can I just weigh in? Yeah, I mean, I think Irene hit the nail on the head in terms of the current state of things. I think there's reason for optimism, perhaps $1 billion worth of optimism. MIT's announced this new school in AI, and as I understand it, it's not just going to be on the technical side of things, but it's going to be a lot around the involvement of ethical thinking and development of AI.
The College for Computing, for those who don't know, MIT just got $1 billion commitment to build a new building and start a new college and perhaps have a new major. And I go to these town halls and I say, what about the ethics? What about, this would be a great time to start having this discussion. And hopefully we do continue to.
And I would say, along with that, there's a saying in the security world that it's not just an IT problem. Security is a people issue, right? You can't just tell all the IT folks, oh, you got to deal with it. Just let me do my work. I think it's the same thing here. This is an issue where you need people with a computer science, data background, but also people that are trained in other skills as well. And you've got to find some common language to talk about these issues.
Oh, definitely.
Claire, I wanted to ask you, so you also operate in a heavily regulated space, but you also, when we were talking before the panel, you mentioned that there are things that you encounter where there still aren't regulations and you do have to have ethical discussions along the way. Could you give us some examples of those instances?
Sure. I would say that there's few areas where there aren't any regulations, but yeah, I mean, there's one discussion that we were having recently was around, do you show people data about their health if you don't have a treatment for them, or you don't have advice that you can give them about what to do? That's a very different sort of ethical question. We also run into a lot of questions, ethical questions around bias in sample populations. It's kind of a known issue that a lot of the samples that a lot of the genomic data that we have is from people with European ancestry. And if you do research on samples from people with European ancestry, then you will have better treatments for people with that ancestry. And so that's a huge issue, and that's something which we try to address in some of the direct-to-participant studies by actively recruiting people from minority populations.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that we've sort of already touched on, but I want to revisit is how do we actually create regulations that don't limit innovation? Because a lot of what each of us have been talking about is there is this trade-off where the moment you start to place these regulations, things get slower, your data is more limited, and perhaps you don't have a business plan because you can't sell things to advertisers. So I'd love each of your thoughts on how you're thinking about those questions.
I think it just always has to be a balance. For us, all of the tools that we're building, at the end of the day, we're trying to enable researchers to make advances in science. And researchers can't make advances in science if they can't get the data. So we spend a lot of time building tools that give them access to the data, that help automate the process of confirming whether they are properly consented to use the data, and then allowing them to search the data better. So it takes a lot more effort to do that, but it's really worthwhile. I mean, we know what happens if we don't have those regulations, and if we don't spend that effort. There's a lot of historical examples of very bad ethical practices.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The Tuskegee experiment. This is an experiment that happened in the U.S. Starting in the 1930s and continued up to 1972. And it was research in the progression of syphilis over time, and it was done on black male sharecroppers in Alabama, so a very vulnerable population. And they didn't tell these participants that they had syphilis, and they didn't tell them that there was a treatment when it became available in the 1940s. And this continued up until 1972 and stopped once it got into the press and there was kind of some public outcry about it. And a lot of the regulations that we have now came after that. So after that, the U.S. Public Health established having IRBs and started a commission that then wrote something called the Belmont Report that established a lot of policies in this area.
I'll echo Claire and say that the analysis, this is not the first time innovation has happened in this country that could have run rampant and then was later regulated. So the FDA has a lot of principles that for algorithms we should really be looking at. So informed consent has been brought up many times. Even having people who have sponsored trials have their names on it. So which company is collecting your data? What do you hope to use that data for? And if that ever changes, you need to tell everyone. If what you're doing is very similar to something that has been has already been approved, then perhaps you don't need to go through the same owner's process as has been already done. Maybe you can say that this is close enough, and we're going to give you a slightly lighter weight regulation. I've been doing a lot of reading recently, and although they are starting to regulate algorithms at the FDA right now, it's a very different field. So I think there's a lot of very common principles.
I really don't think we can afford to wait on regulation. We're in the U.S. right now. Canopy just set out its principles. Like, we're going to build a system that can't be used against people, and we're going to take that as our main challenge and just go after it. We're not going to wait on Congress or anything to catch up. It does require an incredible amount of transparency.
Okay, I have one last question. This is the lightning round, and then we're going to toss it to audience Q&A. And the question is, what is one thing that you can recommend to everyone sitting here today to start doing once they leave this room? Either as an organization, someone running an organization or a project, or as a consumer to actually push forward this conversation about data privacy.
I think maybe the biggest thing is to not assume that it's going to get solved without you, and assume that it's not your responsibility. I think all of us in our work face these issues on a regular basis, and it's really easy to say, like, oh, I'm just the engineer. I'm going to build whatever they tell me to build, or I'm technically obeying the law. So I'm trying to make money, so I'm gonna do that. I think it's important to, in your daily life, consider the implications of what you're doing. Because as we said, we know that law is behind, and it's gonna take some time to catch up.
I guess I've got 3 points. First, if anyone has $15 to $20 million they would like to invest, that would be a very concrete step you could take tonight. Short of that, if you have an iPhone and would like to help us build a better internet, we can put you on the list as we're rolling out our app. Only 50 people have the app today. It's soon to be 125 more tomorrow. So your voice will be heard. Lastly, I've found myself doing this is just assuming that whatever data I send off my device is going to fall into the hands of somebody I don't know, and I don't know what they're doing with it. So I have to ask myself, is this worth it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's not clear, but that's the question I ask myself.
Okay, so I didn't grow up here, in case you didn't pick that up yet. And I think that a lot of the regulations and the privacy concerns are really culturally driven. Right? So the level of tolerance in a society, obviously the Europeans are very far on the extreme privacy side of things. I think we're somewhat in the middle. I think China, people are very lax. They're quite comfortable to walk into a store, get face recognized, pick something up and walk out the store and not even take their wallet or their phone out of their pocket to pay for it. So there's a spectrum here. My sense as somewhat of an outsider is I think that the cat is already out of the bag in the USA, right? And I'll prove it to you by looking at our kids. So we have teenage kids, and they think nothing of posting the most intimate details about their life online, right? In fact, they enjoy that, right? So I think the whole data privacy, it's a little late, frankly. And other than fraud and healthcare records, consumer stuff, it's out there, and I really think it's going to be tough to rail that back, right? Sorry. But speak to small companies like Google and Facebook and whatever. They've made very good successes out of this. So first recommendation is go tell your kids, by the way, whatever you put online is permanent. And 10, 20 years at a time, this could have a damaging effect on yourself. But I think my biggest concern is not so much the data. I think we've passed that point. It's more the algorithms, like Irene and Claire were saying. And my concern is around the machine learning and the AI and having a piece of software making decisions about our lives of which we're not even aware. Things like credit scoring and even picking, offering up different options in terms of flight pricing and things like that. I just think we don't understand to what extent machine learning and AI is actually impacting our lives. And they're making small decisions for us now, but they could be making some really large impactful decisions for us in the future. So I think the data's out, but it's what's being derived off that data which is the real risk. And that's where I think we should focus. And one more piece of research I forgot to read out here. But the EU actually has created a commission for ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. And I think I see Irene nodding there. And a lot of the elements around diversity, auditability, traceability, governance, transparency, training. There are efforts to do that. And I would say, so my second suggestion, one is go tell your kids be careful. And number two would be, if we're going to focus our attention, the data's already out. That's not coming back. There's multi-billion-dollar companies built on this. That's not going to change, in my opinion. But I do think what type of software is using that data to make decisions on our behalf, that's the modern risk. And that's something maybe we can get behind on the society level.
My advice for you, Greg, is to not be cynical.
So as the only student on the panel, my advice is to stay educated. I did not, when I was at Dropbox, clearly we did not think about these things, and now I am many years older and I have thought about them a lot more. If you are a consumer, an individual, knowing what is out there, what is being collected about you is incredibly important. There's a piece that went out recently about a reporter who decided to go 1 week without any Facebook-related products, 1 week without any Google-related products, 1 week without Apple, 1 week without, it's 5 different companies, and then a final week where all 5 are gone at the same time. And it turns out it's incredibly hard. And even having that experiment, which I had never seen anyone do before, is incredibly important, just knowing what technology you're implicitly buying into. If you are in a position where you're accessing data, where you're analyzing data, or you're at all control of some data set somewhere, thinking about who has access to that data, how is it collected, do these people know that you have their data, what are you using it for? These are all important questions that you should be asking. And even if you don't have the most ethical response or the most, you don't know exactly all these answers, it's important to start asking.
Wow, there's so much to talk about here. I know there'll be drinks later and I hope the conversation continues. Just maybe 2 quick points. I have teenage kids. Yeah. They think it's normal for a Boston team to win a championship every year. That's all they know. With respect to data and privacy, you're right. I mean, that's the world they've grown up with. But I don't think that's necessarily here to stay. So I'm going to differ with you on that point, just to play devil's advocate. I think, and you've seen it back already. I mean, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal hit, people were dropping Facebook, right? And there's been some pushback about Facebook and publicly about their privacy standards and compared that to other big companies. And I don't think it's inevitable that people are just going to continue to give their data freely to these companies forever and ever. And this newer generation is very tech savvy. I think at some point they're going to understand that perhaps they can reclaim some of this and they don't have to give it away for free. Maybe they can monetize it if they want, but they don't have to give it away for free. So I think things may change. And we have to understand too, the companies that rule our tech world today didn't exist 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So things can change and can change in a hurry. So I would just maybe push back on that. I totally agree with you on the algorithm question. And I think on that, my takeaway would be, I think it's essential to the human condition to be optimistic, right? I do. I think you have to be optimistic. And I think we have to be true to our values. And you cannot just let things get away because it's too complicated, or it was too difficult a conversation, or you didn't understand, or you didn't have the resources. I think it's essential for all of us in the room who obviously have an interest in this issue to continue to dig away at this and ensure that credit scores are not prejudiced against groups of people, or healthcare results are not biased against groups of people. I mean, it's essential to ensure that doesn't rule the day at the end of the world. So just have to continue to be optimistic about the ability to impact change on this.
Let's give a round of applause to the panelists. Okay, so we have 10 minutes. I was hoping to leave 20 minutes for you guys, but this was a really exciting conversation, so I didn't want to cut it off. So let's try to fit in 5 questions. Yeah, does that sound reasonable? Do we have a separate mic for the audience, or?
Push that one.
Great.
Hi, thanks for this really interesting discussion. John, something you said was like, if companies want to, and I'm paraphrasing, but like, if companies want to be on the right side of regulators, they kind of have to get out in front of the privacy thing and build up their own infrastructure. Maybe that solves the problem. And I was just wondering, like, if you had, it seems like you can do that, try to anticipate like a regulation, but that still leaves you at a moral minimum. And I was just wondering in terms of like GDPR and the fact that AI can be so opaque and like hard to understand. What do you think the bottom line is going to be in terms of like regulation that people can understand and consume?
So what's the prospect for developing helpful regulation in an area that's
So opaque, yeah.
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 I think that's like a core thing, and I think big companies are trying to anticipate that and make moves where they're still going to be able to be as exploitative as they are now, but they'll be able to like check a privacy box,
Yeah.
basically. So like everything moves on your phone, but we still use all of your data, or so as a for instance.
Right.
So,
Well, I alluded to this earlier, and I don't know if it's directly helpful or not, but I do think that this is effective regulation is a collaborative process, and I don't think one company can just draft up some legislation and go hire the lobbyists and try to get it jammed through Congress. I don't think that's going to work, but I think legislation that is the product of industry consensus, if you will, with the input of other constituents as well, has the best prospect for success, both in terms of passage and in terms of trying to cure the problems in the most plausible way possible. So I think it's a collaborative process. If that,
yeah.
does that?
No, that makes sense. I think it's just thinking about industry. Maybe it's not one company, but maybe it's like 4 companies who have a real vested interest in maintaining an infrastructure and like profit motive that they have right now in terms of like consuming user data and making.
Yeah, but I think if the companies that are interested in getting effective regulation, I would think that they would want to have a broad swath of industry representing both established companies, but also companies that are coming into the area as well. Otherwise, the legislation or the effort could be attacked as too protective of the economic interests of a small segment of companies. So I would hope that the best prospect for regulation is something that's a little bit more broad-based than that.
Who do you think would attack it? And that's my final follow-up. Like, who do you think repeating the follow-up?
Yeah, repeating the question for the benefit of the live cast. Who do I think? Who would attack? I think there are groups that are out there. Look, large segments of the population just don't care. Maybe they've already given it away. But there are groups that are closely tracking developments in this area, right? So they do look at any impending legislation. They do put out white papers on it, and they do try to rally the troops. So you want to try to have an industry, if it's an industry-specific group that's trying to get something passed that makes sense, it would also make sense to try to get some of those groups on board with it as well, so that they don't attack it in front of the legislators.
If I just add one little thing, there's an interesting model for setting regulation using consortiums, and the goal is to use the consumers of the data, not the producers. So for instance, let's say we want to regulate self-driving cars, right, and the AI that happens inside of them. Don't have the software companies create those rules. Have the car companies create those rules, because they're the ones who have their interests aligned with the end user.
Hi, my name is Peter Dwyer. I'm working at CVS Health these days. I'm a cyber security database guy basically these days. But the biggest, I also happen to own MrOptimist.com. But anyway, what about George Soros's mortal danger in China thing that's going on now? I didn't hear much comment on that. I happen to think that is a key fear I have. So.
Anybody?
Not familiar with that.
No.
Do you want to elaborate? what you
Educate
mean
us a
by
little
that?
bit, Peter.
Well, George Soros evidently has a campaign saying the biggest threat to people's freedom and right now is China's focus on AI and its set of rules that they have.
Do you mean like applied to their citizens
Yes.
or?
It's
the-
referring
Other
to,
citizens at least, and I don't know well.
to give a little more context, this is referring to George Soros' comments at Davos, where he said that the way that China is currently using AI to surveil its citizens is a mortal danger to everyone, given that they are a rising AI superpower, and that sort of translates AI very easily allows them to translate their political and social values and export them to other places. For context. Does anyone have?
Well, no other takers. Maybe I'll just, I was going to mention earlier that we live in a brutally, globally competitive landscape right now. And it's not written in stone anywhere that the United States has to be a leader in AI, right?
Or in the law.
Or the law. I mean, however, I think it's essential, again, for our country that we do figure this out. And dysfunction in Congress shouldn't be an impediment to people with an interest in making advances here in an ethical way that, advances the technology in a way that supports, the healthy growth of the human race. That should go forward. So. I'm not sure I have a specific answer to the question, other than I do think it's essential that we're not the only ones at this right now, and we got to figure it out.
I'm going to say this for the fourth time tonight. I think it's really important to build systems where you don't have to trust the builder of the system.
I have a follow-up to your point, which is that I think in order for there to be alternatives to the system that China builds, the US is currently the best posed to do that, given that we have the biggest concentration of AI researchers and talent. But there needs to be more government support for that. The reason why China is able to build such a colossal system so quickly is because they have a huge AI national strategy, and it is one of the biggest things that they're throwing all of their resources at. And fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, I don't know, Trump announced the beginnings of a US AI national strategy this past week. But we clearly are playing catch up right now in establishing ourselves as leaders, as Americans. So that is one thing that I think a clear action item for addressing that. Yes.
I have a question of the panel, individually, moving left to right. Who of you have ever heard of John Wanamaker? Has anybody on the panel, let me rephrase it, has anybody on the panel ever heard of John Wanamaker?
Yeah, well,
He was Postmaster General, as I just looked, from 1889 to 1893. Do your homework. He was the father of junk mail. Nowhere in this privacy conversation have I heard anyone mention direct mail. Never.
Do you know how much direct mail is actually suppressed? Spam emails suppressed by spam
Zero.
workers? Zero.
It's unsuppressible.
I think it's around 97% of the emails that you think you're getting 3% of what's really out
Great,
there.
we'll have to talk.
Which is a
This
good
the
question in
second
terms
guy
of
with
using our
friends I talked to
resources.
today.
But
We'll have to talk.
there is a lot of
Let's
effective
try to
technology.
keep the questions questions. Thank you for your comments.
And the question is, who has ever heard of John Wanamaker?
I think that ended in a statement. Mine is not going to end in a statement. It is going to start with one, which is that it kind of seems like the terms and conditions of today are our way of getting informed consent for people to share our data or whatever. That said, how do we build better terms and conditions that people actually read?
They have to be short. It's really easy if you don't store any data. That's not gonna happen. The Canopy engineering team says it's really hard to. But yes, I agree. I've in the past year, I've started reading more and more privacy policies, and my eyes water over, and I just want people to just come out and say, we're going to sell your data. I would take that over the 20 pages.
One of the things that's nice about the GDPR is that you can request your data that the company has been storing on you. So you can say, hey, I didn't read anything you sent me before. I haven't responded to anything. I'm so sorry. What do you know about me? And they have to tell you. And that is one model of having the company be responsible for answering your queries. Similarly, right to be forgotten. I don't want to be here anymore. I didn't read any of the language you sent me, but I have this right. Please delete everything you have of me. And so I think establishing just first principle concepts of what everyone should have is a good way to start. And then maybe you have reading quizzes about your terms and conditions, who knows. But at least we'll start there.
This is another regulation question. I know Canopy, we don't believe regulations will solve this, but I am curious about regulation. So I heard someone recently say that our current antitrust laws are focused on price, right, around the consumer. If the price goes up because of antitrust reasons, that's what most of the successful cases have been fought over. But we think of price as like actual price and not cost of data, right? And actually the cost of data that you have to share, the amount of data, how personal that data is that you have to share to get the same service is actually going up, and could be sort of interpreted as a cost. It was sort of a legalese type of argument about how you could go after some of these big companies on antitrust terms that are hard to do in historical context, right? Like this is not the railroads or like AT&T or something like that. So I'm just curious if you've heard that floated around in this space before and sort of what you think about that.
I haven't. To me, we are where we are given the, we all know why we're here, right? Because there was very lax regulation historically. We are where we are now. I'm not confident that some sort of attack like that using is going to ultimately get us to where we need to go in the future, right? I know there's a lot of creative lawyers out there, but if we want to have a national data privacy law, we should go enact the national data privacy law and shouldn't be relying on antitrust issues or other things to bring it in. It's just too circuitous to me.
Okay, so everything we've been talking about is mainly about effectively one person deciding whether or not they're going to share their data or not, or if their data is being stolen from them. However, I'm interested in instances where things are connected to other people. For example, my social security number, if I share that, it doesn't affect my mother. If I share information about my health, it could affect someone in my family. And of course, there's differences in what I care about. For example, maybe because genetically my mom and I have similar interest in stories, I don't care if that's shared. But something that could come back and hurt her, like mainly I'm saying health stuff. And I think we've kind of not come to that, so I want to ask the panel.
Do you want to take that on the health?
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously your genetic sequencing information tells people a lot about your family. Right now, that's really just up to you to you own your own genetic information. You can consent, unless you're a child or something. But yes, you're absolutely giving away information about your family, and that's an ethical question.
I mean, I think we've all heard the story about the dad who gets coupons for pregnancy, because his daughter has gone to CVS or Target store and been alerted by the patterns of behavior that she's pregnant, where she didn't even know the fact, right? So, once again, I think it comes down to these very clever algorithms that are figuring things out about us that we're not aware of, and I think that's a bigger concern. I mean, the whole question of genetic code and our personal makeup, to me, it's like, what could be more personal around that? And yet people willingly go and they subscribe to have their gene mapping. So there's we have an interesting culture, right? We love to give away this information.
But again, there's a benefits and risks question here. There's a lot of benefit to getting your genome sequenced and getting treatment for diseases that you may have.
I'd love to see GDPR for genome.
Well,
mapping.
you can revoke consent and then we delete all of your information.
Okay.
If you're related to a serial killer, it could be a problem.
Yes, I was actually about to bring up that example. That's a very good example. Personally, I am perfectly okay giving away my genetic information, and if my cousin is a serial killer, like, too bad for them. But that is certainly something which I think should be involved in informed consent. Like, people should be aware of the implications of consenting for their genetic information to be used, and it certainly can lead to some uncomfortable family conversations.
Hello, I have the problem on the other side of the spectrum. I'm a postdoc and I work in MR imaging, and nowadays everyone is talking open data, and you can't publish a paper anymore without also publishing the data to an open repository and also your code. So for us the problem is, how do we make sure that our data is anonymized properly? And people don't want to be mean, they want to do the right thing. And they have done that, like uploaded data over the last years, and now we see actually they thought they anonymized it by stripping away the header information, but it's very easy to find information in the data that can be traced back to a person or other information. So I also work as an editor for a data journal, and I see people publish data meaning well, but it might not be treated appropriately. Maybe Irene or Claire or anyone else on the panel, what are your go-to ideas on how can you educate yourself, or how can you make your data bulletproof if you want it to be stored openly for everyone?
Most of the research suggests that it is impossible to have bulletproof data. There are theoretical results. It seems like someone enthusiastically in the audience has different opinions, but there's a lot of opinions that it's not a feasible goal. Strategies that I have seen with some success. One of the largest clinical healthcare data sets is called MIMIC, and you need to have completed certain training and be approved, but it is technically open to everyone. And therefore, if you publish results off of that data, it is technically open, although it is not actually open to everyone. And so this is sort of a safeguard. There are similar other data sets that are merging with similar other safeguards.
So actually, there's a paper at FATSTAR a couple weeks ago, Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency STAR conference around this stuff at the University of Washington, beyond open versus closed, balancing individual privacy and public accountability and data sharing. And what they're doing is they're actually taking data sets and then generating synthetic data out of it, which has some nice, and they're doing a whole bunch of very cool things with intellectual privacy, solving the Netflix problems of de-anonymization and sort of aggregate statistics. And so there's some cool work happening in that.
So there's a lot of thoughts about maybe we create a synthetic data set similar to the real data set, and then we show that those are results. To my knowledge, there have been no models deployed based on synthetic data, and I'm very eager to see if and when that happens.
So I'd like to see if we can play around with that idea first brought to us by Claire, institutional review boards, and mixing that with industry. Because I think something that Lena mentioned, and I forget where this stands in an academic setting, but there needs to be like some representation from uninterested parties, maybe not on the payroll of a university or something, to kind of, adjust a decision or advocate in a certain direction. And if it doesn't, then, we have this kind of very innate sense that removing conflict of interest in the decision-making process is only going to be to the benefit of people. But if AI is a competitive advantage in parts of industry, do you think there's just going to be like a theoretical hang-up for anything resembling that peer process? Or a completely disinterested set of stakeholders in that process to help regulate in that kind of way what is produced by AI solutions?
So I bet it varies vastly by the application. I bet if you are doing a sentencing algorithm, then the regulatory board that people would agree should be looking at your algorithm, even if it's for profit, is very different than if I'm recommending cat pictures for different people. So in my mind, when I think about these review boards, your question was about conflicts of interest and maybe balancing innovation with regulation. In my mind, it almost has to go back to the original industry. It's not an AI problem, it is a healthcare problem, it is a criminal justice problem, it is a legal industry problem.
And it also had like the facet of competitive advantage, where if you need a peer to really understand the impact of an algorithm that you're working on, you know, are you afraid of giving away your secret sauce that's going to make some money later on?
So the question was about competitive advantage in that if fast speed is important to beat the competitors, how does that play into the regulation of the app? How I did your question justice. Any other thoughts? Dan? No,
I was going to say, first off, which cat pictures you like is very revealing who you are as a person. We're approaching this from many angles. I don't think there's a single solution, but open source is a great way to have people attacking what you're doing. Are you saying what you're doing? It's hard to open source everything you do. Getting disinterested people to audit and monitor that you're keeping your promises is absolutely key. We plan to pursue both of those. Who pays those disinterested people is another question.
One of the possibilities is I went to an event at MIT early last year. It was called Blockchain, Human, and AI, or Blockchain, AI, and Human in some sequence. And they were exploring a technology that's capable, there was a presenter who was talking about a technology that's capable of identifying patterns in encrypted data. So on the one hand, that was pretty scary, because I thought, wow, wait a minute, if I'm encrypting it, I thought that makes it safe, but that's really not the case. But the flip side is you could use that power for the good, right, in terms of using an algorithm to validate another algorithm, especially if it's a different type of algorithm. And there's a lot of work in the industry being done around transparency and understanding, getting behind the black box and understanding what's driving it, and layering in scaffolding approach, which basically brings domain expertise of a business user as an initial construct, and then having the machine learn around it. It's a much more effective way to do things, but also provides transparency in terms of what the machine's learning. I think there's a lot of effort around that, and I do think. And I can't believe you called me a cynic. I'm a startup company CEO. How could I be a cynic and make it past day 2? But I do think there is a lot of effort and innovation around making this kind of technology safer for the industry and more digestible and secure and auditable and all those good things. So I do think that from an optimistic side, there will be a technology solution to allow this other technology to go more mainstream in a way that we can rely on it from a societal perspective.
So,
sorry, we have 2 more minutes and we have one more question. Were there any other questions after this one? Yes, just one. Okay, if you could ask a question and then you ask your question immediately after, and we'll toss both to the panelists at the same time.
Great.
So on one quick comment on Informed Consent, I went to Partners on Monday to see my doctor, and the latest innovation there is that she asks 6 questions, and then she says, "Oh, you don't really like radiology, or your privacy, everything." Sign you. And I said, excuse me. I said, "What am I? I'm a recovering lawyer too. What am I signing?" And she said, "To go on the form." And I said, "Well, what for?" And she actually didn't have it. She had to go into a drawer and got very upset with me. And said that was something that was stuffed into a plastic something. And so we've finally gone past the edge, I think, in terms of what informed consent really is and isn't. My question is really about, I worked on Dodd-Frank and helped lobby for that and helped write the law a while back, and it really happened because of the zeitgeist around financial institutions and banks. I mean, people lost trust in them and sort of they became creepy in people's minds, which is why the regulation happened. And I'm curious because I've been in tech for a while, and tech used to be cool, but for some reason, let's say in the last 2 years, it's kind of gone from cool to creepy. And to me, that's really what's driving this is creepy, unethical, and then eventually illegal. So what is it exactly? And can you sort of put your finger on what's happened in this world where people have started to feel creepy, besides watching Black Mirror about it?
All right, before we answer, everyone think about it.
Yeah, so my question is, what leverage do we, the general population, have for shaping what rules and regulations are decided in corporations and in government? Could we all stop using Facebook and Amazon and Google, or would that be too hard? Could we use our legislature, or do those companies have all these lobbies that make it hard for us? What leverage do we, the people, have?
So just to be clear on informed consent, I was not saying that we have it solved. Still, obviously, lots of.
Don't inform.
All right, I'll go first. For responding to cool versus creepy, I believe strongly that computer science is hitting a moment that a lot of other science fields have hit. So chemical warfare really took chemists from theoretical atoms into a very real concern about why are we doing this, what should we be doing instead, who should be regulating it. Atomic weapons, physicists used to just write equations on the chalkboard, and now we have very real ramifications. The problem with computer science is that it can scale so easily. I can't build a nuclear weapon, but I can write a pretty good algorithm, and I didn't really take that many computer science classes in college. So I think that's sort of the really big danger, and as computer science, as artificial intelligence, machine learning, all these buzzwords have become more powerful and demonstrated that value, we've hit that moment of, oh crap, now what? And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens. One also thought about competitive advantage versus not. My worry actually with these companies is that we'll have a situation similar to Uber in the taxi cab industry, in that there will be regulations and some people will follow them, and then some fast-moving people, perhaps in order to gain a competitive advantage, will not follow the regulations or not want to be peer-reviewed and be slightly outside of that. And they'll move very quickly, and then they'll be worth a $70 billion company soon. And now we have to write regulations around them. That's maybe more okay when you're a taxi company, essentially, but it might not be okay when it's about ethics. So those are my two thoughts. I don't have an answer to you. Hopefully someone else.
We're over time, so I'm going to get one of you to volunteer to answer his question, and then we can all break for drinks.
All right, I'll do it. So, as I said, I think culturally, our society drives what we look for, and I think capitalism works very effectively in this country, and people will start. Eventually, as we mature as a society, we'll start to look for goods and services, technologies, like over here, which is more, protecting our rights. I do also think that the world's going to evolve, and we're going to start to see kind of practical courses in ethics in college, people getting qualifications, not in a philosophy, not in a conceptual Plato perspective, but more in terms of applied philosophy and ethics to technology. As Irene says, that the progression is so fast, and I think that society will take care of itself. And we really are going through growing pains right now, and we have to be tolerant, but we can lead it with our behavior, and then just hope that, hold on and hope for the best.
Let's have another round of applause. Thank you all so much for coming. I hear there are drinks. I'm sorry for keeping you so long from them. If you'd like to continue the conversation, obviously come up to us and we'll be mingling around. Also find us on social media, even though it's creepy and evil. And then finally, just a shameless plug for myself, I write a newsletter for Technology Review on AI ethics, so if you would like to subscribe, it's called The Algorithm. You can go to Tech Review's website and find it, or you can go to bit.ly/thealgo, and you will get right to the sign-up page. So thank you so much for coming.
Great, thank you. Great job. Awesome job.
That was great moderating.